Has missed its restructuring target for its public debt, which was estimated at 576 billion cedis, about $45 billion at the end of November. This is a blow to the struggling economy, as the country has been working to qualify for a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. The country's Eurobonds sank to the lowest level in nearly 3 months after the country missed a self-imposed deadline to restructure its bilateral debt. S&P Global Ratings warned that bondholders face larger losses than anticipated. Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta has wanted to reach a restructuring agreement with bilateral creditors by the end of February to help qualify for a $3 billion International Monetary Fund program. So far, Ghana has only partially completed the domestic debt parts of the exchange plan. We've also seen the cedi slump 21% against the dollar in 2023, making it the world's second worst performing currency so far this year. Joining me now is Emmanuel Ahmad Dakwa, economist and partner at CCAD Global Limited, joining me from Accra, Ghana, as we get into this conversation. Emmanuel, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me again.
Thank you for having me.
So let's look at this target that Ghana set for itself in terms of the deadline for restructuring its debts. Ghana did not meet its own deadline, but there was also the conversation around whether or not it was a realistic deadline. So let's start from there, Emmanuel. Given that it only partially completed the domestic parts of the exchange, of the debt exchange program, what do you say in terms of the target being unrealistic from the onset, or whether or not it was going to happen this way?
Thank you so much. So these deadlines are also fixed in terms of when government would want to approach the board of the International Monetary Fund. In December last year, Ghana was able to successfully get a staff level agreement for the country to get 3 billion in extended credit facility program. And so in the government's mind, they are racing against the deadline of the end of this first quarter, because the IMF board will be meeting very soon. And so as part of the staff level agreement, the thing or the major thing Ghana had to achieve before the board approval would be to restructure its debt, both domestic and external. And so government wanted to race against the deadline of getting to complete the debt restructuring, both domestic and external, and then approach the board of the IMF in March for a possible approval of this bailout. And so that was what informed the deadline set by government. But unfortunately, that deadline has been missed. And government is currently engaging its external creditors for a possibility of debt restructuring.
So in terms of missing this deadline, because as you said, Ghana is trying to make this quarter's staff agreement or staff meeting, as it would be, what do you expect is the working deadline the government is working with now, sort of the time frame or the timeline that the government is working with now?
It's difficult for me to give a definite date on when government is going to agree or finish with the debt restructuring. But it all boils down to the level of negotiation government is going to have. On the domestic side, there have been some steady progress, but on the external side, we've not been able to cling on to any successful debt restructuring from the external side. And so that is what government is, putting together to get the external side of the debt restructured for government to approach the IMF board. In the staff level agreement, it was clear that before the board will approve the final bailout program, government has to make some substantial progress in terms of debt restructuring. So we are looking at the domestic side and the external side. As I mentioned, domestically we've been able to make some substantial progress, but on the external side, things are quite slow. Government has already applied to the G20 framework for debt restructuring, but that process has also been slow. So we look forward to, what is going to happen in the coming weeks in terms of negotiations with the external creditors.
So let's talk about the cedi now. So we've seen the Ghana cedi slump 21% against the dollar in just the first 2 months of the year. And it's now become the worst performer among more than 100 currencies. The cedi also had a very bad 2022, but we saw a slight rebound before the year closed. Are the same things that drove the cedi slump last year continuing to drive the slump that we're seeing now? What's impacting the cedi right now?
Obviously, Ghana is going through some economic crisis, and even government admits that there is crisis on our hands. And so, to solve the crisis, government has applied for a bailout program from the IMF. And so, this is fundamentally what is causing the cedi to plummet as against other major trading currencies. And going forward, it's all about how fast government is able to get a fund program so that, in terms of balance of payment support, and then in terms of raking in investment from the external side, and going into the future, even getting access to the international capital markets, that will bring some level of stability in Ghana's economy. But the same reasons that accounted for the slump in Ghana cedi as against the other major trading currencies are virtually the same that is accounting for the cedi not performing well in the first 2 months of this year.
Okay, so let's look at the interested parties in this debt restructuring. So local bondholders were asked to voluntarily exchange 130 billion cedis of debt for new bonds that will pay between 8.35 and 15% interest, compared with an average of 19% on the old bonds. Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta said the government got an 84% success rate. And to date, local investors have exchanged 87.8 billion cedis, or around 67.5% of bonds, under restructuring for the new securities against the overall target of 80%, which is still more than halfway. In terms of what this tells us about the local response to the government's domestic debt exchange program, what is it telling us, Emmanuel?
In terms of domestic participation, government is just massaging the figures. But wow, of course, if we give government the benefit of the doubt, between 60 to 63%. Let me quote some figures. So in the initial memorandum from the debt exchange program, the eligible bonds government said that that can be exchanged was 137 billion. So if you calculate it as according to what the total exchanges at the end of the debt exchange, about 83 billion, it gives you about 60%. And then government had to revise it to the eligible bonds to 130 billion. So if you also do that calculation, 83 billion divided by the 130 billion it takes you to about 63%. But it's all about the calibrations government is doing. But whatever the case may be, whether 60% or 80%, there have been some substantial progress in terms of this restructuring. In the initial memorandum, you see some stakeholders were not happy about the terms that government was offering. So government had to miss about 5 deadlines to get stakeholders. And even as I speak to you now, the individual bondholders, they are still not satisfied because they were calling for total exemption and not calibration in terms of the coupon rate and the maturity. And so in terms of domestic participation, we've made some substantial progress, but it also depends on what we will get on the external side to restructure Ghana's debt for us to get a possible program from the International Monetary Fund.
All right, so now let's go to the external creditors. And it seems that the goalpost continues to move for Ghana's external creditors now. So Ghana stands to ask, according to some inside, that external creditors write off as much as 50% of the debt that they are owed. This is far above the 30% that the government initially considered and discussed. Emmanuel, in terms of having the creditors, external creditors or debtors, actually take government up on this offer, what do you expect? What are you anticipating when it comes to this part of the equation?
It's going to be tough, I have to be very frank, because of the various stakeholders on the external side. So if you look at Ghana's external debt, you will have bilateral debt, you have multilateral, and you also have commercial loans. And that is where the problem is. A lot of Ghana's debt is in that category of commercial, because in the past 10-15 years, Ghana has been getting a lot of euro bonds, and this is ballooning Ghana's debt. And that is where the problem is, because the stakeholders are many. Fund managers will have to agree on that level of restructuring before they can, sign off on this debt exchange on the external side. And I must say that it's going to be tough, but it all depends on the kind of negotiations the government is going to put forward. And more importantly, external creditors also want to see what government is going to do, especially on the fiscal reforms. Because once you are calling them to write off a percentage of their debt, what is government doing now in terms of sweeping fiscal reforms to be able to get down? And I think that this is the time that government must be committed in some of the fiscal reforms to boost confidence on the external side for them to also write us a percentage of their debt. But I must reiterate that for bilateral and multilateral, the challenge is not that huge. But for commercial loans, that is where the problem is going to be in terms of getting people who hold your euro bonds to restructure or to shave off some of the principal and then to also elongate the maturity. That is where the problem is going to be. But it all boils down to the level of negotiation government is going to have with these external creditors.
All right, Timayo, my last question before I let you go. Government has said they hope to start some substantive discussions with international bondholders in the coming weeks. We also know, of course, that officials of China and the China Exim Bank have been meeting with government officials as well. We know that the domestic debt exchange program is ongoing. What are the next steps we should look at to wrap up Q1? This is probably taking longer than Ghana would like it to have taken. Anticipation of having concluded the IMF agreement in December, then in February. Now we're looking at March. What do you anticipate to happen in the next few weeks as we look at rescheduling payment conversations, the obligation conversations, and so much more?
Government will have to fire for more cylinders because we don't have a lot of time on our hands. And government is racing against the Q1 to get the program approved by the board of the International Monetary Fund. And so in terms of bilateral, government will have to be setting up a lot of negotiation teams to engage on the bilateral level. On the multilateral level too, same must be happening simultaneously. And then also for our commercial creditors, government will have to engage them thoroughly on how best they can also shave off some of their principal and the coupon on the bonds that they hold in government bonds. And so I think in the coming weeks it's going to be very interesting, but government will have to fire for more cylinders to be able to get these debts restructured for us to approach the IMF board for a possible bailout, because the government, Ghana's economic crisis is biting very hard, and the sooner we get the program, the better, so that we'll be able to get onto some macroeconomic stability.
All right, Timayo, thank you so much for your time today. We'll continue to follow the situation developing in Ghana, and of course, we'll be talking to you.
Thank you for having me.